On board. Great. Hopefully you all realize that we're going to be recording and launching these meetings on, I think, a YouTube site. And my understanding is that by just continuing with this recording, you are consenting to having the video uploaded. And Monique has already agreed. We would only have done that had she agreed, and she did. So I want
that later.
Yeah. So welcome everybody. I'm Cindy Fanelli. I'm a professor in electrical engineering and the director of our engineering education research program. And I want to welcome you to this kickoff event for our University of Michigan Engineering Education Research Seminar Series. You probably have heard that we are able to build on the anti-racist momentum from the summer and use our seminar series platform both to amplify the work of Black and other minoritized scholars, as well as to showcase research about the experiences of minoritized engineering students or engineers. And we're super excited about this year's lineup. We're also excited that because our seminars will be held virtually this year, the silver lining to COVID, I guess, we've decided to open the event to friends and colleagues outside of our University of Michigan community. And we're really glad to sort of see so many of you today. And then you might also know about the Scholar Strike event being held at universities across the country yesterday and today to protest racism and police brutality. So that makes it a perfect time to launch our seminars. I want to just note that we're lucky to have such an incredible range of speakers due specifically to the hard work of our EER seminar coordinator, Robin Fowler. Thanks so much, Robin. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robin to let her formally introduce our first speaker.
Well, thank you, Cindy. One of the best pieces about getting to help with this seminar series is all of the fantastic people who I get to meet and now introduce. So I'm excited to introduce Monique Ross. She is an assistant professor in the School of Computing and Information Sciences and in the STEM Transformation Institute at Florida International University. Along with some of our EER faculty here, she earned a PhD in engineering education from Purdue. She also has a BS degree in computer engineering from Elizabethtown College, an MS degree in computer science and software engineering from Auburn, 11 years of experience in industry as a software engineer, and 4 years of experience as a full-time faculty member in computer science and engineering. Her interests focus on broadening participation in computing through the exploration of race, gender, and identity in the academy and in industry, and discipline-based education research with a focus on computer science and computer engineering in order to inform pedagogical practices that garner interest and retain women and minorities in computer-related engineering fields. She was recently awarded the prestigious NSF Career Award, and she uses her scholarship to challenge the perceptions of who belongs in computing. Take it away.
So much pressure. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. I'm quite honored to be part of your lineup. You got quite the lineup this upcoming year, so I'm happy to be part of that. Bear with me while I try to move your faces around. I know, to my understanding, Robin's going to keep an eye on the chat as we go, as well as the Q&A. I'm not as good of a multitasker as I'd like to believe that I am, so I'm going to leave that up to her. So today I'm going to talk to you about cracking the diversity code, understanding the computing pathways of those least represented in order to foster their representation. Spoiler alert, I haven't cracked the code yet, but we are going to talk about a little bit about the journey towards that end goal, right? So I struggled a great deal trying to put together what I was going to talk about with you all today, and decided that I didn't necessarily want to give the traditional sort of beginning, middle, end research talk. I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the journey through the process. We talked briefly, the panelists and I, before we got started, about the necessity to be agile in 2020. But I also feel like that as a education researcher, or researcher generally speaking, agility is a skill that you must embrace and be excited about, because there's a lot of pivoting and turns that go through your research. I mean, you have a plan, but at best, it's just that, a plan. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of that pivoting that we've gone through this work, where we are, and what we plan to do moving forward. So it is a research talk. We will talk about researchy things, but I'm not going to focus on that so much as I'm going to focus on some of the changes or pivots we had to make. So, okay. So what is the problem, right? That's always sort of the beginning. I want to start off by saying that to the introduction, I actually got my PhD in engineering education and did my research thesis work was on Black women in engineering industry, right? So that was my focus, was engineering specifically, looking at Black women. Well, when I moved and shifted into the CS space, I needed to shift a little bit of my research focus, right? It didn't necessarily seem appropriate to continue to look at what was going on specifically in engineering, but to focus in a little bit more to that subset under engineering of computer science. So when I started to delve in to the data, some of my students said, hey, they had recently met Matt Olin from Purdue and had learned about his midfield database. They said, hey, what if we did some analytics on intersectionality, looking at breaking everybody apart. Let's look at how the men are doing, but let's also look at race and ethnic backgrounds, and let's look at how the women are doing and race and ethnic backgrounds. And so if you look at this particular chart, that orange line across the top is where the white men are. Everybody else is at the bottom. Right, so when you look at white women, Black men, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander, international, all of those fall in that very bottom piece, right? And so that alone was sort of a stark, disappointing fact to stumble upon, right? We knew that there was this disparagement within computer science, but we weren't necessarily prepared to see such a stark difference. All right, I keep clicking in the wrong place. So then we took the white men out. No diss to the white men in the room. I love you all, but we took you out of this particular data set so we could dive in a little bit deeper and look at where women and then everybody else sort of fell in. So we zoomed in a little bit, and that orange dotted line across the top, again, that's white women, and then you have everybody else sort of falling down in the bottom. When you get into the deeper, right, and you start to look at representation, for instance, of Hispanic women, which are your yellow dotted line there. They're way down there at the bottom. There is some positivity there. The number seems to be trending on the upward swing. When you look at Black women in particular, that's your green dot. You see this dive off, but then you start to see a little bit of an uptick. So again, there's a little bit of promise that things are getting a little bit better. But overall, when you look at the representation of Black and Hispanic women here in comparison to white women, there's again this huge drastic gap between those two, right? And then when you look at Native American women, which are the black dotted line across the bottom, I mean, they're non-existent and continue to sort of be not participating within computer science or not being allowed into those spaces, right? So these are all pretty sad information, right? And so this, these types of revelations, I'll say, specifically when you first started to look at women's participation, there tended to be in the literature this shift and movement within the computer science education research space where people were starting to notice, right? They were noticing that in the 80s, women represented somewhere around 40% of the population, and that over time, up until now, 2020, there has been a decrease over time, right? They're down now, depending on whose data you look at, between 13 and 17% of representation of computer science enrollment. So it drew attention, and you started to see this wealth of literature that was growing around women's participation. You saw them looking at things like omission of women from history, the way computer science is branded, what is the climate and culture like in computer science, what are the ambient cues, what are the things you see in a computer science department that may deter or deflect a woman from participating in this space. Then you had sort of like the deficit model, like things, lack of access, lack of role models and encouragement, stereotypes that exist. You saw a wave, I think, like in the 80s and 90s of like this stereotype shift of computing be a predominantly male field and predominantly white male in particular, right? And so it was pushing people out. And so you saw all of this research start to happen. And then after all of that research came a lot of movement to initiatives to try and impact that gap, right? How do we get more women? And you've seen the tide turn. You started to see that women's participation started to go up at certain institutions, right? So to give some accolades to some folks, right? Like Harvey Mudd, you know, changed the way they did introductory computer science. They offered it to everybody. It wasn't something that you had to declare a major to get into. And when they found that they offered it to all of their incoming freshmen, they saw an increase in women's participation just because they didn't know about it, and you don't know what you don't know, right? So as soon as they had exposure to it, you started to see these shifts, and they are getting to parity with women and men in computer science. Carnegie Mellon, same kind of thing, did a lot of assessment and evaluation, and they decided, you know, they were eliminating a whole bunch of women by just looking at the criteria that we're using for admission. So they started shifting a little bit. Instead of focusing on whether or not you had done programming before you'd come to the university. They were more focusing on things like, were you in leadership roles? Were you the head of the journal club? Those kinds of things. Other attributes that made for good computer scientists, but were largely ignored due to these stereotypes that sort of taken over and pressed to the norm. And because of that, you started to see a movement, right, in the numbers broadly across women, slightly, but broadly across women, this change. And in these particular institutions that were very targeted in their efforts, they saw huge drastic changes, and they've shifted the parity within their computer science departments. And there are other institutions that have taken that lead. The problem, however, and so you'll start to see, like I said, white women are starting to uptick, right? The problem is, however, that this doesn't, while it has shifted women more globally, it hasn't done much for women who fall at the intersections of race and gender. So Black women, Hispanic women, Native American women, Asian women, right? You're not seeing the movement and shift in their participation rates over time because, surprise, surprise, there are instances where they're not similar, or their experiences are slightly different than those of the dominant group. Okay, again, reminder of where women are. So this pushed me to start thinking about, in conjunction with my research group and talking to my research peers, okay, we need to start building the case on why it's so important to start looking at Black women or Hispanic women in this particular case, so that's the context of this study, more explicitly, right? Not letting them sort of be a byproduct of a larger study, but really letting them be the focal point to what it is that we're trying to solve. This problem that we have, this underrepresentation, we really need to give them the attention they deserve to really understand their pathways too. Because as you can see from these numbers, this is just the women, but the graphics I've showed you before have shown you the men and the women. Our Black and Hispanic men's participation in computer science is also incredibly low. And when you looked at the literature on the influences for white women into computer science, it was largely by, their father, their brother, their uncle who participated in computer science. Well, if Black and Hispanic women also have underrepresentation of their brothers and sisters, and our brothers and uncles and father, they're not going to have the same pathway into computer science. So we really needed to give it that deliberate attention, which brought us to critical race theory, which has recently become like a 4-letter word, apparently, that you're not allowed to talk about. We're going to talk about it today anyway, right? And under the umbrella of critical race theory, there are a number of different theories that have taken hold, and I'm not giving these in chronological order, they're there, right? And so you have things like feminist theory, standpoint theory, queer theory, Black feminist theory, but in particular today, we're going to talk about intersectionality theory. Intersectionality theory was established in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw was a legal scholar who really pushed everything forward, right? And she pushed everything forward I'm going to give a really bad summary of what happened, but in the automotive industry in the 80s, there were a number of lawsuits that were being brought forward. One was based on race, right? So Black people were saying they were being discriminated within the workforce based on race. And there was also a lawsuit based on sexism, which was women were coming forward saying we were being discriminated on the basis of sexism in the workplace. And then you had Black women who were like, well, we have both, right? We've experienced both, and it's so complicated and crazy, we can't even tease it apart. It's hard to understand whether or not it was racism or sexism or the combination of the two, or where I fit in the hierarchy. And the legal precedent at the time was, yeah, well, you have to pick one, right? You have to decide whether or not you're going to go with this lawsuit on racism or this lawsuit on sexism. And Kimberly Crenshaw said, yeah, that's a no. So she was followed by Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Sherry Moraga, who have put a spotlight on this idea that we need to stop looking at this global idea because not everybody's experiences are the same. We need to really give explicit attention to these women at the intersections of race and gender, to look at things like power and privilege and oppression, and how is it leveraged differently by these different women in these different spaces. And we really need to be deliberate about it, and we need to not play around with trying to skirt around, oh, well, they're included. We really need to give them the attention they deserve. So I had gone to a colleague of mine and was saying, this is my dilemma. I want to try and build the argument for why we should look at, for instance, Black women in computing. Very specifically, I want to know how they're doing. I want to know what their influences are. I want to know what their pathways are. And so we started looking through the literature, and while there are scholars who have been advocating for this push, there wasn't a lot of literature published. A lot of the literature either said, okay, let's look at people of color, or let's look at women. And what we were really interested is looking at those women that were in that intersection of race and gender, right? So a colleague of mine, and before I move forward, I want to tip the hat to CS scholars ahead of me who had been already engaging in these conversations, and they were sort of the birth of the Black computer movement. So I want to tip my hat to things like, to people like Doctors Valerie Taylor, Jamaica Burge, Quincy Brown, Jaquita Thomas, Jeremy Wasom, Mikhail McCullen, who have been sort of fighting this fight before me. However, with this idea, Dr. Zara Hazari at FIU said, hey, I have this huge data set sitting around, which, I mean, don't you just love it when data sets are sitting around, right? I have this huge data set sitting around. We could do some secondary data analysis where we look at this FICSIT. It's called Factors Influencing College Success in Information Technology. It's a mouthful, right? Where they had put out a survey to 118 institutions. They had 10,203 respondents. It was done in 2014, and it went to introductory college courses. So like your introductory English classes, you know, introductory psychology classes, the gen eds that people are required to take in that first year. And it asked them a ton of questions, but the ones we were going to focus on for this particular study was whether or not they had intentions of pursuing a degree or occupation in CS or IT. And specifically, we wanted to look at, because the arguments were always being made, it's either people of color or women, we had decided that we were going to compare Black women to people of color and women, right? So I'll unpack that a little bit further, bear with me. So we decided we were going to call them near peers. And what we were going to do is we were going to disaggregate the data, pull the Black women out, and then we were going to do a series of quantitative tests to compare them against non-Black women, which is everybody in that purple shape there, right? All the non-Black women in the purple shape, right? Which is about N of 2,358. And we also were going to compare them to Black men, because when you look at those current literature, those were who they were being compared to. And let's see how things pan out. And so we came up with research questions, right? Because that's what you got to do. Came up with research questions and decided what methodologies and what methods were going to be best appropriate. But the gist of it was we wanted to see what were the similarities and differences between Black women and non-Black women and Black women and Black men, right? So where were they the same? Where were they different? Where did they fall in between? Those kinds of things. And then what kinds of influences were predictors of CS and IT for those women? To lead this work, we used the theoretical frameworks of social integration. So we were really interested in like what kinds of clubs they participated, after school programs, whether or not they had CS in school, things like that. Obviously intersectionality, because we were doing this disaggregation of data on the axis of race and gender. And then standpoint theory, which was sort of this idea, those who have studied feminist theory, that it's important to understand the perspectives of those who are oppressed, right? And the idea is that they have a perspective that is not just their own, but they have some understanding of others, right? And so when you're in an oppressed position, you learn how to operate in your world, right? So in my case, being a Black woman in the world of being Black and being a woman, but I also know what it's like to operate within the white world, right? Because that's the world within I operate, right, as a faculty member. So having that standpoint and being able to see things from different types of approaches. So I say all that to say, we ran all these statistical tests, right? And what we had come up with is, if you look at these charts, right? So we had questions about, you know, influences from family members, influences from after school programs. So whether or not these influenced these were predictors for whether or not they went into CS or IT, their friends, whether or not they found CS on their own or if they found it in school, right? And so if you look at this, you'll notice that in this, and the little Black woman indicates the Black woman, right? So for family members, they were very similar to Black men as far as their chances that they were being introduced to CS by family members. When you looked at after school programs, they were actually more like the non-Black women, right? So they were more like women in that regard. However, when you started to delve into whether or not they were introduced to CS by a friend, learned it on their own, or learned it in school, they weren't like either one. They weren't like the Black men and they weren't like non-Black women. They were on their own. So there was something unique about their experiences that made them different than their near peers that we had defined earlier. For instance, they were most likely to learn about computer science in school than any of the other groups. The bad news was it was such a terrible experience, it was more likely to be a predictor that they would not choose CS and IT. So it was such a bad experience if they had it in school, that they were most likely to get it from school. And then they were least likely than any of the other groups to be introduced by a friend, right? Or no, I think they were most likely to be introduced by a friend, but least likely to have a friend in CS. That was the drawback, right? So these pathways that we knew were most prevalent for their exposure to CS were usually mostly negative or not very friendly, right? So the good news, right, in light of all that potentially bad news, was that we had made our case, right? Mission accomplished, right? We had accomplished the mission of saying we need to spotlight and make Black women's experiences like the center of what it is that we're doing based on this quantitative analysis we had done. I'd like to believe that in light of Black Lives Matter and all of the anti-racist rhetoric, we won't have to go through a full study to make that argument anymore, but it's done, box checked, all right? So we use this as the basis for another study, right? We now knew friends were important, school kind of sucked for them, right? And that they weren't likely to do it on their own. So how were they making it to computer science? So we had crafted a pilot study that took place at a small Hispanic or a large Hispanic serving institution where we were going to talk to Black and Hispanic women about their pathways to computer science. And we had this great big plan. It was going to be a qualitative research study. We were going to talk to 6 Black women and 6 Hispanic women who were undergraduate students, either in computer science or computer engineering. We were going to leverage that intersectionality again. We were going to use social identity theory. Hold on to that. I'll explain that in a minute. And we were going to answer all of these questions, right? This is where this whole plan and agility comes in, right? So we had decided this is where we're going to go. However, as we got started and we started to do the recruitment was going fine. But in conversations I had had with other colleagues of mine and other scholars in the space, it was brought to my attention that somebody said, well, what about graduate students, right? Like, would I know this place that has a lot of Black women graduate students in CS who are PhD students? You know, what about them? Would it be beneficial to talk to them sort of about their experiences? And I thought, well, you know what? It's not a bad idea. I mean, like, if anybody who is going to be sort of a model of persistence in computer science, it's going to be those who are pursuing their PhD in computer science. So we pivoted a little bit. This is our first pivot, right? Our first pivot was, okay, we're going to look at those undergraduate students, but we have this graduate population ready to go. Let's go and talk to them. So we talked to 6 Black and Hispanic women PhD computer science students. Again, we were using intersectionality and social identity theory. So social identity theory is defined as a series of subconstructs, right? It's this idea that we see ourselves as an identity, right? So you're obviously, you're, you know, for me, I may be Black, I may be a woman, but I may also identify as a researcher, as a mother, as a computer scientist or an engineer. And a lot of those identities are really critical and important to things like persistence and engagement and long-term within these different types of disciplines. It's been long-standing in science ed. People have, you know, studied it in physics, they've studied it in chemistry, engineering, and computer science. And the subconstructs are things like being interested in the field, feeling like you have some type of competence and you can perform within that space, feeling like you're being recognized by others. All those things contribute to a development of a social identity theory. And if you have a very salient or strong social identity theory, you're more likely to continue and persist within a space, right? And so that was one of the frameworks that we used. Here's what happened though. So we started interviewing these 6 PhD women in computer science and found that they talked a great deal about their pathway to and their interest in how they got engaged and interested in computer science. They talked about their performance. You know, they'd done really well in school. You know, they felt really confident in the area and competent. They felt like they were recognized by their teachers, by their peers, their guidance counselors, and those kinds of things. But when I asked them, do you see yourself as a computer scientist? Only 2 of the 6 said yes. And 4 of them said no. And my mind was blown because now I had an identity crisis of my own. I had really come to believe that social identity theory was really going to help me understand persistence and prolonged engagement in computing. And here I was talking to women who had reached the pinnacle of their academic computer science, right, journey. And they were all telling, well, the vast majority of them were telling me, no, I don't see myself as a computer scientist. So this left me stumped, right? This was my next pivot, right? Why is this? And how do I explain this? And how do I make sense of this? And so I started talking to some of my colleagues, shout outs to Dr. Catherine Berdanier and Kathleen Cordokas Fisher, saying, hey, and I explained the whole situation to them, and they said, have you looked into landscapes of practice? And I had to admit that no, I hadn't, but I did what every self-respecting researcher did. I ran out and bought the book and read it voraciously until I had some understanding of what landscapes of theory were. And I said, aha, this kind of explains what's going on. So I'm going to explain that a little bit. So we pivoted and we developed new research questions around what an intersectional community of practice might look like, and what is that? What are the implications of that? And I'll explain that a little bit. For those of you who may know about communities of practice, I won't bore you too terribly much. For those who don't, though, communities of practice are this, so taking that social identity theory, right? You put a person within a community, and inside this community, they learn things like the discourse or language or vocabulary. They learn the norms and values. They learn how to participate in that space. They know what things are valued within that space. They develop relationships, right? And you tend to learn better within these spaces, right? So there's a whole body of work around situated learning, around communities of practice. But the idea is that there's the shared practice, shared values within a space. And so an example of a community practice might be National Society of Black Engineers, or Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, or ASME, or ACM, or SWE, or any number of student organizations or professional organizations. But they're also in classrooms too, right? But there are these communities or these spaces within which you work. The creators of communities of practice took it a step further and said, we don't just usually belong to one community of practice, we instead belong to many communities of practice, and that makes our landscape of practice. And within that landscape of practice, a person may move in and through many communities of practice, right? And they may never take residence in any one place, or they may take residence in places, right? But what happens also is, in some cases, those communities of practice have what are called planes of overlap, right? So in some cases, like if you were a computer science researcher, for instance, you may have a computing community of practice, but you also may have a research community of practice, or you may have some overlap between those two. You do research and computing, and thus there's some overlap. Here's where things get a little bit tricky. Things get a little bit tricky when you start to think about not just belonging to this community of practice and traversing through these different communities of practice that are your landscape, but there are instances and cases where you may not feel like you belong within that space. And that may be because norms and values conflict to what it is that you're, or you don't see yourself as belonging in that space. In which case, you're considered a tourist or a sojourner, which means you're passing through, but never really taking up residence, which means you're sticking sort of in the periphery of what's going on within that landscape. This was the best explanation that we could come up with for understanding how these women could make it to a computer science PhD and not feel like they belonged within that space enough to take on the identity of a computer scientist. As it turned out, our interpretive case study, which looked at these 6 women, and I'll explain a little bit further here, these circles, right? So you see the one circle where there's 5 women in that circle, right? 4 of which are Black women, 1 was a Hispanic woman. They were all part of the same computer science research group. I'll tell you that this computer science research group was majority Black women. I think there were 15 to 20 Black women in that computer science research group. There was also, we had a counter narrative, a woman who was a Black woman computer science PhD, but she was not in that research group, right? And we analyzed both of those spaces. I'm not going to get into too much detail about that, but I will point you to the papers later on. Okay, so these were our participants. As you could see, most of them were 2nd through 7th year PhD students. We asked them a whole bunch of questions to kind of get an idea of how they got there, who their influences were, what their experiences were when they got there. We did some cursory reads about their interviews. We used social identity theory at first to do some initial coding to get an idea of whether or not they were talking about things, like I said, their interest, their recognition, their competence, and whether or not they felt recognized in that space. And then we use in vivo codes so that we could find out what they were telling us outside of that theory, right? Which is where we get this landscapes of practice. We then coded, for lack of a better word, or sort of parsed out moments of impact. So where were those moments through their trajectory where they really felt like this was the occupation for them, or this was the discipline that they wanted to pursue? Boundary spanning, which was this idea of traversing through those different communities of practice across their landscape, and then where they felt like they had residence, right? Did they feel like they belonged within that computing community of practice? And this is sort of an example of what we did between moments of impact, boundary spanning, and those communities of residence. And much like I sort of alluded to, 4 out of the 6 said they didn't take residence in computer science, right? They talked about their performance being really high performing, did really well. But they just didn't see themselves as computer scientists. In some cases, just felt like while they belonged in their research group, this intersectional community of practice that was developed that had the intersection of Black and woman in computing, they didn't feel like in the broader computer science community that they belonged. So the answer to research question 1 for that was this idea of this intersectional community of practice, right? And that's sort of better articulated here in this diagram. The second one, though, was what were sort of the benefits and the drawbacks of that, right? The benefits were a lot of these women felt like they really belonged within that space. They felt like really strong researchers. They felt like really good computer science researchers in that specific research group. They had opportunities to demonstrate their competence. A lot of them were presenting at conferences. They were, publishing papers. One got a GRFP, which they felt like was a huge validation of their research abilities. However, when you ask them about sort of the broader computer science community, they felt like they didn't have a lot of opportunities where those 2 spheres actually intersected or had that plane between them. They still saw it as these 2 very discrete places, and they didn't belong in that last one. And because of that, they always sort of felt like they were on the periphery of it, meaning they never really felt like they could take up residence as a computer scientist. So what were some conclusions to this work? We had decided that intersectional communities of practice were amazing, right? Like it was a very beautiful experience. I would say it was borderline spiritual to be around to sit and talk to these women about their experiences and their exposures and their backgrounds and their pathways. I would argue it did aid in their persistence. And if I had stayed on the participant list a little bit longer, you would have seen a lot of them had come through the pathway of an HBCU. And so they had, in my opinion, sort of all of these support systems all the way through until they ended up at a predominantly white institution for their PhD. It did reinforce existing identity salience. So if they already felt like they were a computer scientist, they definitely walked out like, I am a Black woman computer scientist. It's all converged, just one big, great, beautiful thing. But it was not a good place to foster it. So if they came in not really feeling very strong as a computer scientist walking in, they didn't feel any stronger. By the time we talked to them. They hadn't graduated yet, but they were in the throes of the PhD. There definitely needs to be some scaffolding done between this plane, this intersectional community of practice, and the broader computing community. And that may be more deliberate overlap between what they do in their research group and where they publish and or present, and even probably even pushing them to step outside that bubble a little bit into places like, active participation in things like ACM and IEEE and the more, I'll say, traditional computing spaces. But also it may be that it doesn't matter because maybe computing identity is not critical to persistence for Black women, right? So remember, circling back, part of the idea was really being able to look at Black women specifically. All of the research in the past that says, yes, computing or identity is so important, but when you really dig deep, nobody's looked specifically at, was that the thing that helped them to persist, right? And it may be that's not as critical to Black women as it has been for other populations. So we ended up leading with more questions, right? And this is back to the 2020 agility. If not identity, then what? What other motivation helps for prolonged sustainment for Black women, in particular for this in computing, right? And furthermore, maybe we need to better understand the ontology in relation to identity. How do we come to know what computing is and how do we define computing, right? So maybe the definition of computer scientist, right? What makes it so unattainable to make you think that you cannot claim that as an identity? And maybe it's a matter of the fact that when people graduate with their degree in computer scientist, very few of them go on to take a title of a computer scientist, right? They're software engineers, data analysts, coders, testers, any number, data scientists, right? Any number of labels that don't necessarily say computer science, right? And so maybe that has more to do with it than anything else. Future things, we're going to be expanding this further to look at, I mean, we're in the middle of doing the analysis on the undergraduate students, so we need to finish that. But we're also looking to expand to outside of our Hispanic serving institution that we've been doing this work in, to look at predominantly white institutions, HBCUs, other minority serving institutions, and other Hispanic serving institutions. We also want to unpack further friends. We've revisited the interview protocol to make some adaptations to really explore what that role is in influencing. In our cursory read of the undergraduates, it's huge, right? A lot of our students were actually in other majors, be it psychology or I have an English major, a humanities major. They've made shifts, and a lot of it had to do with a friend who drug them along to some ACM thing or some SWE thing that sucked them in, and they pivoted and changed. So exploring that further, expanding our frameworks to include things like community cultural wealth. So really trying to unpack the differences and uniquenesses of Black women when they bring into this space and how they come to the space of computing, and Hispanic women. And then I'll also sort of tip my hat at the idea of remaining agile. A plan is just that, a plan. So as you saw, we pivoted a lot. I'm running out of time, so I will give my acknowledgements to NSF, my co-authors on papers, all of my wonderful students, and all of our amazing participants. And I'm done. Questions?
So I just want to start by thanking you. I'm sure that there are people clapping in their offices and basements and extra rooms, and we just can't hear them right now.
I'll hold on to that.
I'm going to start with the question that's been in, and also in the chat. There are some clapping happening. First question is from DeAndre Wilson Eherjerika, and I'm really sorry for messing up your last name. But they wonder, is there an explanation for the Black women spiking in the 1990s and then decreasing over time?
So that was an anomaly we had to point out, and so that paper is under review, but part of what happened was the midfield data had this, they have people, the short version is universities opt in and opt out of this database. And in that particular instance, we had a spike in HBCU participation, and then they pulled out. And that is why it's so important to look at HBCU and participation, because it has a huge impact, but that's what happened.
Got it. All right, Phil Sand says, hi, Dr. Ross, and thank you for being here. Given the unique experience of Black women in CS and thinking about the components of social identity theory, are there differences in the type or source of recognition that reinforce identity beliefs with regards to computer identity, particularly if they aren't taking residence in the computer science space?
That was a long question. I mean, I would argue that there's a need to continue to revisit social identity theory and how it's defined currently versus how it should or could be defined when looking at the intersections of identities, right? I feel like and this is just a hypothesis at this point, I'm kind of spitballing, but if I were to guess, I would guess that the types of recognition are different probably across different races and gender, and how the amount of recognition that is taking place, right? I think a lot of the times, I mean, you see a lot of sort of rise in t-shirts about like underestimate me, right? There's a lot of underestimation of Black and Hispanic women in these spaces. And so they may not be getting the recognition that we consider to be traditional recognition in the classroom by a peer or an instructor or those kinds of things. They may have to seek it other places, or we have to be deliberate in making sure that we put those recognition opportunities in place. But I feel like this is a call to action to further push on that social identity theory when looking at intersections of race and gender.
All right, jumping up to Antonella Avogadro Amade asks, at what point in their academic journeys do women tend to leave the field most on average?
From what I have read, from prior literature, it's all over the place. I mean, you see retention problems as early as that first programming class, which is why sort of Harvey Mudd was so groundbreaking with their work. And if you're not familiar with it, what they did was they offered multiple tracks of the introductory programming class. I think there were at least 2 tracks. There may have been a third, but they offered one for people who had never programmed a day in their life, and then the one for people who had been programming since the womb, right? And because you now had 2 different types of personalities, experience and exposure going into, in a normal programming class, you have this huge variation, right? And so you tend to then think, well, I don't really know anything, so I can't really, you know, hang with these other people who've been doing it and know the language and the discourse and all this, and they know the tools. But they split them out based on this ability, but then they all came out with the same outcomes, right? So nobody was better than the other, but it took out sort of the pressure associated with that variation of ability. And that was, I would argue, it was one of the things that impacted those numbers the most. And so if you look at, so NC WIT has a lot of really great data, Anita B. org has a lot of really great data. You'll see that we fall out in all different kinds of spaces, and including making it all the way to the finish line, getting a job, and then saying, you know what, this isn't for me. So I feel like there's a lot of places where we can repair or give attention to.
Adrienne Decker wonders, what was the area of the research group for the PhD students studied, like AI or human-computer interaction or architecture?
HCC, human-centered computing.
Susan Montgomery wonders, are there suggestions for those of us who mentor students to encourage them to stay in CS?
I mean, I think telling them all the time, right? I feel like a lot of the times we sort of skirt around it. I think there's plenty of opportunities for encouragement. There's opportunities for them to practice, right? A lot of that identity formation, community practice stuff is not just absorbing things, but opportunities for practice. So like if they're in a PhD computer science program, urge them to write that abstract or present at that conference or write that journal article, but don't just be like, go do it, right? You need to scaffold and help them along the process and give them that feedback. I'd also encourage them to create a community of their own, right? So if they are Black or Hispanic students, try to create opportunities for them to meet other Black and Hispanic students in CS, right? That community, I can't emphasize enough how much my community has done for me, right? So being able to have a community of Black women in engineering education or computer science education has really been critical in helping me to continue in this space, right? And so I feel like providing opportunities for your students to create that space, engage legitimately. So being able to participate in those conferences and those journal articles or presentations, it'll be rough, it'll be hard. It takes them outside that comfort zone, but it provides them an opportunity to practice and feel like, yeah, I can do this, right? So I think lots of encouragement, opportunity to practice, and building community are the three things I would recommend.
Nicole Ramo wonders, did you also interview the PI of those PhD students in the same research group? She's curious about their background and the pathways and how that influences their mentoring.
I did not interview them officially, but I did speak extensively with that particular person about why they do the things they do and how they came to this. And it's an amazing story. I can maybe get permission to share it.
Cool.
Sorry.
Cecilia Laplace wonders, I found it interesting that computer scientists don't often align themselves with that identity, and you posit it might be due to other job titles and focus areas. And she wonders if the same identity problem persists within software engineering majors.
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think it's an ontological thing. It may not be the identity itself. Like maybe it's a matter of just shift of the word a little bit. Instead of saying, do you feel like a computer scientist? Do you feel like a computing person maybe, or a computer person maybe enough to be able to get them to go, oh yeah, that's what I do. Or, and so that might be part of it, right? And so we're toying with that as well. Or it may just be that, like I said, one of my students conducted a study where they looked at like all the different names of jobs that hire computer scientists and the titles. I mean, there's tons of them, right? And so I do think that maybe some of it has to do with that sort of what do we consider to be computer scientists, right? Is it just purely theorist, PhD, and graph theory and computing are the only people who get to take it, or only algorithm developers of complexities, right, are the only ones? Or if it's if it's that we've sort of just said that only these people can be computer scientists, and maybe it should be more inclusive of an idea.
Kalia Braswell asks, she says, hi, Dr. Ross, love your work. What's your take on informal learning CS opportunities for Black girls, even though the data set you mentioned showed that they didn't have a huge impact on Black women?
Thank you. And I mean, I think we need it, right? I think it wasn't that it wasn't a predictor, it was that they didn't have a lot of those opportunities, right? These particular women that we were, or that particular data set, I think even predates things like Black Girls Code, right? So there weren't a lot of opportunities for Black girls to get involved in things. And so I think informal learning is huge in being able to make shifts. It'll provide opportunities for them to have the exposure. Just that particular data set, there was not a lot of opportunities to participate in those kinds of things. And so they just weren't getting it.
Kristen Moore says, thanks so much for this talk. I'm wondering if your participants illuminated anything about the ways systems of oppression show up in the academy in general or in CS specifically, and I wonder if your data suggests that communities of practice provide opportunities for pushing outward and for resistance against these systems of oppression.
So that's a complex question, but and I didn't get to delve into it because I knew I was going to run out of time. But what I did find interesting, right? So we had this intersectional community of practice that was largely Black women computer scientists, right? And then we had the one Black woman that we interviewed who was not in that research group. So she was in a traditional computer science research group. She could talk endlessly about the axes of oppression within computer science and the things that were said to her, the experiences she had, how she was so isolated. Like she longed to be part of this other research group. They just didn't do that kind of research, right? And so she was kind of forced. And so she actually sort of oscillated back and forth between her community, her research group, and this other group for support, right? Because she didn't have a lot in this space. Now, this intersectional group, that was what was so unique, is right? Like they owned it. They called it their little Black bubble, right? They had a lot of support. They had a lot of encouragement. They had each other. They had this very sort of unique experience, but that was it was great and it was beneficial, but the drawback was they felt like they hadn't quite crossed into this broader community, right? So I feel like there's something special there, and there are things that we can leverage and replicate in that space with just a little bit of tweaking to expand. But the broader, it sounded like, and we'll still unpacking it with the undergraduate interviews, and we'd like to talk to more Black women in computing more broadly across different, like whether or not they're an undergrad or grad or an industry, different spaces, right? But it sounded like the one woman, man, she just was getting beat up at every twist and turn in her experiences in computing with race and gender and you know, the conflation of those two.
DeAndre Wilson Ejejarika says, again, you touched on it on one slide, but what are the most significant factors where Black women experiences are unique to Black men and to women of other ethnicities? And what do we need to do specifically for Black women that's different than the other groups?
I can point you to the paper to get you more insight into that. I can also tell you that from our cursory qualitative study of the undergraduate students, they're building a community is critical, right, of your own, even if one does not exist for you, right? So you may not feel like ACM or SWE or I can't think of any other right now, Wix are not necessarily your space. Creating your own space with, you know, some of your peers in your classes or friends even at other institutions, right? Like, so we hosted an REU this summer, and one of the things we're toying around with, they're all at different institutions all over the country, is having them stay connected throughout the academic year as their own community, right? Like if you're at a predominantly white institution, you may be the only Black girl in your computer science department, so it's really hard to find a community, right? So trying to find ways to break down barriers to finding communities outside just your own little, not little, but your own university, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that has been one of the critical things that keeps coming up over and over again.
Lynn McVan Newstead asks, what are the positive and negative contributions of industry to retention of women in the field?
They could certainly do more, right? By way, I mean, there's a lot of different barriers, right? So there are other barriers that maybe I haven't talked about, that we're finding are things like even the technical interview, right? The technical interview process in after you graduate with a computer science degree is incredible, right? They, you know, you don't just have a resume and an interview. They have to code on the spot. They have to do whiteboard elements. They have to, you know, create algorithms step by step, like on the fly, right? Like there are all of these which seem like crazy expectations, confounded by the fact that, for instance, like at FIU, the vast majority of our students work full-time jobs, care for family members. Where is this additional time that, I mean, the expectations for some interviews is that you're spending 35 hours preparing for them, right? And so that becomes a barrier in its own right? And there's all this mystery and mystique around these interviews. I feel like there's a lot of opportunity for industry to help with regards to bridging or breaking down some of those barriers, or revisiting why they put them up in the first place, right? And being really deliberate at looking at who are they keeping out by these barriers that they've constructed. So things like that. And then I also feel like just traveling back in time, right? I feel like, especially right now in this virtual world, right? It's hard to travel to institutions to talk to students, but now you can do it all through a Zoom call, right? And so really tapping into the community engagement, whether or not with local universities, with HBCUs, minority serving institutions, or even with informal learning settings, not forgetting to sort of lift as you climb, as industry partners. And that's for everybody, not just for Black or Hispanic women in those spaces.
Kalia Braswell asks, what are your thoughts on self-efficacy and self-determination for Black women in computing?
So self-efficacy is getting a bad rep right now. It is currently under scrutiny for not having necessarily being kind of like social identity theory I'm finding right now, right? It wasn't necessarily established or founded looking at underrepresented minorities in these spaces. And so some of the things that they measure and value in self-efficacy don't necessarily translate to minoritized populations. And so there's an article out about anti-deficit frameworks that gives alternatives to self-efficacy, that look at other types of capital, so to speak, that students have that they bring into the space that can sort of substitute for some of the subconstructs of self-efficacy. I mean, I feel like it is important to feel like you can complete tasks, right? I think there's no doubt to that. And that's sort of not really what performance competence is. And so we do measure it, but there are other things that probably could be measured in lieu of some of those. So I would push you to look at some of those. And I think if you just Google, I think it's Harper's anti-deficit frameworks, you'll see a list of different frameworks that you can look at that measure similar things, but not necessarily self-efficacy. And I don't know much about self-determination. I mean, I'm familiar with it, but I can't speak to its applicability in this setting.
Last two questions here are about identity. So Brian McSkimming asked, for those graduate students who didn't identify as computer scientists, is there a different label that they did identify with?
Some of them said things like, I'm trying to think of some of the things. Some of them use like alternative titles, right? But the vast majority of them saw themselves as problem solver. They sounded actually more similar to how people would describe in engineering, right? There were other titles that they were using to describe themselves in that space, but I don't know that we asked them explicitly, if you're not a computer scientist, then what are you, kind of question, but maybe that's something that's worth exploring.
And relatedly, Cecilia Laplace asks, could there be a cultural effect causing identity between many different computer stuff titles? And so she says she found in her degree there's so much oppression even within, you know, like people arguing CS is better than software or whatever.
I mean, I think all the way around there's a hierarchy within computing. I would agree 100% that yes, that there is this false hierarchy of what titles outrank others or are more computer sciencey. And yes, I absolutely think that plays a role into some of this self-identity. And that's why I think understanding ontology a little bit more, what do they believe a computer scientist is and who can claim it and who can't, will help us understand, I think, a little bit more as to whether or not that hierarchy is playing in a role, or if it's the titles that's playing a role, or if there's some other thing that's playing. So really trying to dig into how are they even defining computer scientists, and why don't they see themselves as being part of that?
Okay, there are two more questions here that we'll get to, but I want to, before I jump there, I'm going to cut off the questions. So if you add more questions, I'm not going to ask them, but what we will do is our goal after the Q&A is to move to a sort of social time. So we've got until about 5 o'clock officially that we can stay in the Zoom webinar. I will go through and individually unmute everyone, which I think is the best way that I know how to do this. This is our first attempt at a Zoom social, so we'll see how it goes. We're really excited at the idea that there are so many people from so many different institutions who get to mingle, unlike when we were holding these in a physical space on our campus. But we do realize that there are going to be some limitations because of the new medium. So back to the last two questions. So Nagash Clark asks, what are your thoughts on anti-Blackness theory?
Anti-Blackness
They say it's a
theory?
new term that they learned recently.
I don't know. I'll have to read about it. I don't have any thoughts. Sorry. But I'm now going to write it down because that sounds scary.
And the last question, which I think is a nice one to end the session on, Jocelyn Jackson asks, what are some things people who aren't Black women can do to support Black women in CS?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I mean, I feel like the non-Black women in my spheres who have been the most helpful have been so by just being supportive and encouraging and wanting to learn more about, not like I feel like right now there's a lot of fatigue around asking questions about how people feel about sort of the anti-racist movement. So not those kinds of questions, but I'm thinking things like, you know, asking, you know, your Black colleagues what they're working on or what their interests are or what they're reading currently or those kinds of things that you can glean from and be supportive about. I feel like, and listening, right? I feel like listening is sort of a lost art these days, in listening to each other. And engaging, right? Not avoiding engagement with your Black colleagues. I feel like also amplifying the voices of your Black colleagues, whether or not that you're, you know, your Black research group member, right? And the work that their contributions and work to the space, and honoring also sort of the invisible labor that your Black and Hispanic colleagues may be taking on, being the only person. I was just in a conversation earlier today around there's sort of a not even an understanding of how many Black students may go to the Black faculty member or the Black graduate student in that group, or how many times they may be tapped to sit on panels to bring diversity to a panel. Or to be photographed and put in brochures. Like all of those things come with an emotional labor that I think a lot of the time goes unrecognized. And so I think recognizing that, even if it's just like, well, thank you, right? I think goes a long way as well.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Ross. This has been really fantastic. I'm gonna stop the recording.